Well, hello there again, friends. Today is 3/8/2022, and today is the Odin Project Vlog Day 75. And so today I went through 69% complete with the course, with the Intermediate HTML and CSS, and I got through browser compatibility and frameworks and preprocessors. So without further ado, let's get started. So starting out with browser compatibility. This one's a short read. Um, it reads pretty quick. A lot of it's stuff we've already been introduced to, if not familiar with. Um, so I'll read through that. I'll go down here to the assignment section. There's this really cool excuse me, article called "Can I Use?" It's really cool. So I bookmarked it. I suggest you do the same. Um, it's a reference tool to find out if whatever it is you're trying to implement, if it's available in different browser versions. We kind of had a similar file that we saved or site like this. We either saved it, we at least talked about it in a couple videos ago. But I like this one. Again, I'll caveat this with the same caveat I did for the other ones. I'm not entirely sure that this is uh, super up to date or how often it stays up to date, but it's pretty cool. So, like, if you're trying to do, say, a var, you can type that in, and the first hit is going to hit anything with VAR in it, but the first one's what I was looking for. The HTML element bar, and it shows you actually a lot of plethora of different types of browsers, and it shows you what version is compatible, what version is so green is compatible and gray is unknown. So you can try, basically it's kind of like a guess. You can try it out on it and see. But obviously with var or any other command or element, the more green you have across browsers, the better your user experience is going to be. So that's kind of a cool site. And then there's an article that goes over iOS. Basically, as far as compatibility goes, it just basically says that against popular belief, the iOS for phone and tablet, the only browser you can have is Safari. Even if you download, even in the I guess I don't have, I'm not a fanboy of Apple, so I don't have Apple products in my household. But so pardon me if I get some of the verbiage wrong. But basically, if you go out to the uh, Apple Store, whatever download store, if you try to you can download versions of Chrome or Firefox, etc. But the thing is that what people don't realize is they're skins. So actually, the back end of it is WebKit, which is Safari's rendering engine, and so basically, it just puts a Firefox skin over top of a Safari engine, and that's the same for the phone, the tablet, and on the computer currently, as of this reading anyway. I don't know if that's as of today, but as of this reading this article, they were saying the desktop version is currently the only one where you can actually basically go somewhere else, basically the Chrome store, and Apple will allow you to download and install the actual full version of that browser and use it. And that was basically what the whole article was about. It's not super long, but it's very interesting. And then you go under the knowledge checks here. It says, what is the most used browser currently? And it's Chrome. Go figure. I use Chrome on my normal Windows workstation. Firefox here, obviously, but in my VM. And then Chromium, which is based on Chrome. It's a project, but everyone's kind of the W3C consortium's kind of getting on board with Chromium. In fact, Edge, I learned this from not only the course here, but in my job, my day-to-day job. Edge is part of the Chromium project, so Microsoft Edge is actually technically Chrome. it's got that, it's running that Chromium engine. I don't know exactly what it was called. It doesn't really matter for this discussion, but I guess maybe it's just called Chromium. But basically, Google developed it as a open source project for, in hopes to bringing on the other companies into a standard build and making it open source. So that's the whole point of the project in a nutshell. There's a lot more detail to it, but the point being is that Chrome's still a dominant player in the market. And then the next question, what was the original name of the first web browser? This is kind of interesting. A lot of this is just historical stuff, so I won't spend too much time here, but it was called the World Wide Web browser. I didn't know that. That's kind of funny. And then it was later renamed to Nexus, to not to be confused with World Wide Web when CERN came into the picture. So that's kind of cool. And there's a lot more history on it. I'll let you guys read up on that. And the last one was, how are mobile browsers different on Apple operating systems from Android? Excuse me. So I already kind of covered that a moment ago when we were talking about Apple and Safari. So on Android, the difference there is that on Android you can download and install anything. That's what I like about Android. They don't care what you use. It's not a black box mystery system. You can install Chrome, you can install Firefox, you can install whatever you get your hands on. Brave, any browser, DuckDuckGo. So it's open source. Anything that's open source is basically available on Android. So legally, shall we say? So that rounds off that topic. So next we're going to have frameworks and preprocessors. So this is a lot more meatier compared to browser compatibility. So going down here to the assignments, read everything obviously as always. So these articles kind of go over the different balances, the advantages, and I won't click them because we're basically going to answer them via the knowledge check. So basically the top portion just kind of talks about frameworks overview, like Bootstrap and Tailwind are heavy lifting, and they're common frameworks for CSS. Then they give example Bowman Foundation as a couple other ones to look at, and you can click on look at, and it's kind of cool. You can go out to Bootstrap or Tailwind's website and just read about them, and I did do a little bit of that just to take a brief cursory overview. They talk about disadvantages of frameworks, preprocessors. So the first question is, what are some advantages of using a CSS framework? So it takes you out to this Smashing Magazine article, which is actually a pretty good read. It's long, but there's a lot of like stupid ads in the middle of it and dumb stuff like that. But it is a pretty good read. It flows pretty well. And so we're looking at the advantage of using CSS frameworks. So she talks about like why choosing a framework. It's interesting. So she takes you through. She puts a question out there in Twitter. This article is pretty old. It's from 2018, but she puts a question out there and has a ton of replies and retweets, saying if you've chosen to use a CSS framework like Bootstrap or Foundation for your project, what were the main reasons for doing so? And she goes into this. That's kind of how she starts the article out. And one of the many advantages is that you get documentation basically that you may or may not have when you're working on a team if you have vanilla pure CSS. The hope is that you have documentation, but a lot of times small teams or all large teams alike, if you don't have a basically a framework forces you into a common code base, so there's an advantage to that. Online communities make it easy to get help if you need it. The grid system, some people are saying that they went to a framework because they liked the grid that was offered, but she kind of offers a counter argument there that that with the more recently advances of CSS Grid on the pure CSS side, might not make this such a viable option. There's some things to be desired. I'll let you guys read into the grid system more to learn about that. But if you need to get something up really quick, and you're a startup or you're trying to do an MVP, which stands for minimal viable product, a CSS framework is the way to go, really. This is kind of what she was basically saying. And then what are some of the disadvantages? So it's the same article. And so some of the disadvantages, she comes down here. Sorry, I gotta remember. Okay, so why not to use a framework? Difficulty of overriding framework code. So she kind of talks about if you use a framework and you get used to using it, it's hard to go back, both in habit forming of syntax and also because you have to rewrite so much stuff that you get basically the law of diminishing return sets in over time, and the longer you use that framework, the harder it is to break away from it. So, and then all websites end up looking the same. It's kind of an argument that, well, if say Bootstrap has this one look and feel to it, and 10 companies are using it for their landing page, the argument is that all those 10 websites are going to look the same or very, very similar. And that's important to think about when you're deploying and trying to create your brand. Is kind of you want to differentiate yourself from your competition and look different. So you got to take that into consideration. She says the difficulty in overriding framework styles, already mentioned, is a large part of why site development is in using a particular framework will tend to look similar. This isn't just a creative issue. It can be very odd as a user with few websites have to opt for all the same framework. Makes it feel like all the sites are the same, basically. Inheriting the CSS problems of the entire world. So this kind of piggybacks. It's a long way of saying, excuse me, is that you're relying on one person or a small set of, a small team that developed your framework, but you're inheriting whatever problems they had in creating that to the entire world because you're using the same framework as everybody else. Everyone kind of has the same problem. So you just take it from the stance of inheriting problems that you didn't originally have and you now have because you chose this framework is kind of a negative. Performance issues. So you can have performance issues when you're using frameworks. It has to be considered in your decision. Related to the above are performance issues inherited in using fairly generic code rather than something optimized for the exact use case that you have. So basically, what she's saying is if you have one library, for example, you're using, but your Bootstrap or whatever framework you have has 20, I'm just throwing some numbers out there, it's very inefficient because you're only plucking out that one or two libraries you're using, but you're still having to process, and the browser's still having to, process through and load potentially 20, exact example, 20 different libraries, so it's super inefficient. Learning a framework rather than learning CSS. So basically, this isn't us, because we're learning pure CSS first, which I am very thankful for and very grateful for. But a lot of new developers come on and they don't take the time to learn CSS, pure CSS, and they just go straight to a framework, which creates not bad developers, but she's using this as an example that these developers then have to go back and relearn pure CSS or vanilla CSS if they want to either A, switch to a different framework, or B, be a good developer and be able to troubleshoot problems with frameworks, because there are problems and bugs that do come up that you won't be able to easily navigate through if you don't understand the basics of CSS. So and comes with that knowing what that framework's doing. And then the choice doesn't consider end users. This is a unique one. I never thought about this one. Of course, this is all new to me anyway, but one of the things that she talks about is everybody and their brother that's a developer and on a developer team chooses a framework that works best for their stack. And they never take in consideration the end users or the client that they're building it for. Namely, the UI and UX experience is never really thought through very hard, or not, or in her experience, not as much as it should have been, which might end up having you not choose a framework, maybe going with vanilla. Depends on what the client needs. And then can we replace frameworks with vanilla CSS? Kind of already talked about that. And create a document pattern. Okay, so kind of go over that. So what are some advantages of using processors? So I want to go into processors here, CSS preprocessors. So basically, in a nutshell, what a preprocessor does, it's different than a framework that it extends your variables, operators, interpolations, functions, and mixins with many more usable assets. You learned about that briefly in the top reading there before you get to the article. But basically, this introduces your ability to basically kind of shorthand CSS, but then you compile it into actual CSS using that specific preprocessor's compiler function. There's a lot more into it that I don't really have time because we're already at 16 minutes. So I don't want to go into too much. But one of the cool things about the CSS preprocessing is that you have dry, which I thought it meant for like dry code, but it means don't repeat yourself. So this is what your syntax would look like in CSS. And on the right is what it looks like. So left is regular CSS, right is a preprocessor example. So see how it's not really, you're not having to sit there and repeat yourself every single time you want to create a selector, versus when you're using a preprocessor, it will understand that, hey, you're using, for example, font weight bold on all three of these, so we're just going to add it to the first one, and the preprocessor will automatically add it to the others in the background. But you have to know that it's doing that. That's one of the downfalls of preprocessor. But the advantage of it is that it creates more succinct code. Easier to maintain, meaning that you can declare your variable at the top, in this example using the @ sign, main color, and then everywhere your variable is used inside the rest of the CSS, it will be filtered down. We've already kind of learned about that in previous videos, but variables within your CSS. But this is an example of using it inside of a preprocessor. More organized. That's a short article there. Some of the disadvantages of CSS preprocessors. So this is interesting. So debugging is harder, meaning that because preprocessors is like what it sounds like, you have to compile that preprocessed code into CSS. It doesn't start in CSS. It converts it. You have to know what it's doing. Otherwise, debugging is really hard. So you have to kind of know how it works, why it works, and because when it breaks, you got to know how to fix it. It's one of a big drawback. 2 is compilation slows down development, and that's basically what it sounds like. So the more you have to compile, the slower it becomes, and the bigger it becomes. I think it mentions it later in this. Yep, right. There you go. They can produce very large CSS files, so you got to be careful with preprocessor use and overuse, because every time you have to compile your file, your CSS file becomes larger. Maybe not in like syntax wise, but your file size becomes larger, and so the browser has to take more time to chew through all that data in the background, and you'll lose control of that. You got maintenance and over-engineering. Sometimes using preprocessors is over-engineering something that never meant to be that difficult in the first place. So if you're only using a preprocessor for like one thing, it might be easier or worth a consideration of not using it, just because your use case doesn't require it. Something to think about. Tooling and developer convenience. Preprocessors require extra tooling. Code authors shouldn't be forced to use a particular editor just to be able to use the tool. That's the tail wagging the dog. So earlier in the article, or in another article, they talk about most preprocessors don't have a way to compile the preprocessed code by itself. So you have to either download another tool, and that's why I say extra tooling, or you can download Vscode does have an extension for SAS, I believe, as one of the preprocessors. There's many in one of the articles that talks about it. But the problem with that is you have to have it. You have to know it's there. You have to download. It's just more things to keep track of. And obviously, as you know, the more stack you put in your technology stack, the more possible spots for prone to error. So just remember that. Saving generated files or not. Again, we kind of talked about the size, capability, and understanding. We already kind of went over that. The same principle applies here as it does with the negative of frameworks. You got to understand it. You got to learn it, know it. Variables, mix in, next thing. So, and that rounds it out. So 21 minutes here. I want to end it here. Keep this video from going too long. So please like, share, and subscribe for more content, and let me know in the comments what you guys think of preprocessors and frameworks, and if you've ever used them. I've not. This is all new to me. It's cool to know this stuff. I'm glad that Top is teaching us, and thankful and grateful, I said earlier, that Top is teaching us vanilla CSS first, because I think that will help us in our work down the road, whether we go with a framework or a preprocessor. So with all that said, until next time, see ya.